Welcome to the world of TrendPod AI.
Hello.
Today we're diving deep into a pretty significant development over the U.S. healthcare policy.
Yeah, and looking at the potential knock-on effects, really, across the globe.
Specifically, we want to focus on India's pharmaceutical industry, right?
Exactly. Our mission today is to unpack President Trump's recent executive order, the one aimed at lowering U.S. prescription drug prices.
And figure out what that means for Indian companies, as they supply a lot of medication to the U.S. market.
A huge amount. And yeah, we'll be drawing on some insights from Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw. She's the executive chairperson of Biocon. She talked about this on Business Today recently.
Okay, so let's start there. President Trump's executive order. The goal is bringing U.S. drug prices down, closer to what other high-income countries pay.
That's the gist of it, yeah. And it seems the initial target is more of those, expensive branded medicines.
Right. But this isn't the first step they've taken recently, is it? Wasn't there something back in April?
That's right. Good point. There was an earlier order back in April that was actually encouraging generics and biosimilars.
Biosimilars. Those are like the generic versions of the really complex biologic drugs.
Exactly. So that April order was more about pushing for affordable access through those pathways.
Which you'd think might actually be good news for Indian pharma companies, given their strength there.
Well, yes, that's what it looked like initially. And Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw kind of echoed that sentiment about the April order.
But this new one is different.
Her analysis suggests it is, yeah. This latest order seems much more focused on, let's say, big pharma and the pricing of their branded drugs. The big price differences between the U.S. and, say, Europe.
That price gap is really something, isn't it? I think I saw a stat about the U.S. market value.
Oh, yeah. It's stark. U.S. Secretary Kennedy pointed out that the U.S., it's only about 4% of the global population, right?
Right.
But it accounts for something like 75% of the value of the global drug market.
Wow. 75%.
75%. So you can see why the U.S. government feels there's an imbalance there that needs addressing.
Definitely fuels that perception. Okay, so alongside trying to adjust prices, there's also talk of tariffs. Import tariffs on medicines coming into the U.S.
Yes, that's another piece of this puzzle. We're hearing potential numbers maybe in the range of 2.5% up to 10%.
How would Indian companies handle that? I mean, that could eat into margins.
It could, potentially. President Trump has sort of signaled that products made in the U.S. would be exempt, while imports would face the levy. But there's an interesting point Mazumdar-Shaw raised.
Oh, yeah.
Pharmaceuticals were actually exempted from tariffs in the recent U.S.-UK trade deal.
Huh. So that sets a precedent, maybe.
It certainly could. It's something to watch as U.S. India trade talks evolve. Definitely.
Okay, but let's say tariffs do happen in that 2.5 to 10% range. What's the feeling there?
Well, Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw's take is that Indian companies could likely absorb that level of cost
Without a major hit.
without a catastrophic impact on their margins. That's the assessment. These are often high volume, lower margin generics anyway, many of them.
And she also touched on the idea of maybe shifting manufacturing to the U.S. to get around tariffs.
Right. But the economics of that, they might not add up.
How so?
Well, India has really efficient, established manufacturing. Setting up the same thing in the U.S. could actually be more expensive overall.
So expensive that it might just cancel out the benefit you'd get from avoiding the tariff.
Potentially, yeah. It's not a simple calculation,
Right.
especially for generics and biosimilars, which are already operating under significant price pressure in the U.S. market.
Okay, so this whole situation, it does make you wonder, should Indian pharma maybe try to rely less on markets like the U.S., maybe focus more on emerging markets?
It's a fair question strategically, but Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw had a pretty clear view on this.
Which was?
Basically, that every market is important. And India, she argues, already has a strong, diversified global presence.
So no need for a big pivot.
Her advice seems to be against any knee-jerk reactions. She seems confident that Indian companies can compete effectively everywhere. U.S., Europe, emerging markets.
Just keep doing what they're doing, essentially.
Pretty much. She doesn't see these developments demanding like a fundamental change in their market strategy right now.
Interesting. So if we look ahead then, short, medium, long-term risks for Indian pharma exporting to the U.S.
Yeah.
What's the overall feeling? Is it manageable?
Based on her analysis, especially if those tariffs stay in that, 2.5 to 10% band,
Yeah.
she views that as manageable. She doesn't seem to anticipate a major negative shock to the Indian generics and biosimilar sector?
In long term.
Not a major one, no. Part of the reasoning is that these drugs are often essential. They're already part of affordability initiatives like the Affordable Care Act.
Right, they're not the high-priced branded drugs this order seems primarily aimed at.
Exactly. And heavily tariffing essential, affordable medicines. That ultimately impacts U.S. patients too. Plus, bringing manufacturing of all those commodity drugs back to the U.S. might not be realistic or even desirable from a cost perspective.
Okay, so pulling this all together, what does this mean for you listening in? It really highlights just how tangled global economics and healthcare policy are, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The U.S. wants to lower drug costs for its citizens, a understandable goal. But the ripples, they spread far, hitting major suppliers like India.
And the view from someone like Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw suggests, well, maybe some resilience in the Indian pharma industry.
Yeah, pointing to their diverse market strategy and just how vital generics and biosimilars are for affordable healthcare everywhere, including the U.S.
It really drives home how interconnected everything is. You know, a policy decision made in one country can force businesses and governments thousands of miles away to rethink and adapt.
Constantly adapting, constantly strategizing.
Makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many decisions that seem purely local actually have these huge, unseen global consequences spinning up? Something to think about.